The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jennifer Schaus, and we are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today as we continue our U.S. Federal Government Contracting Webinar Series 2016. Today we are very lucky and fortunate to have Aaron Grau join us. His topic today is the politics of procurement. So for all of the government contracting companies that want to understand how to leverage public affairs, lobbyists, Aaron will cover those topics. So just some housekeeping. If you do have questions for Aaron as he goes through his presentation, you should see a control panel on your right-hand side. You can type in your questions there, and we will answer the questions in the order that they are received. The webinar is being recorded, so should you need to jump off early, make all of the presentations for all of our webinars available after June 17th, which is the last day of the series. So again, thank you all for joining us, and the list of the other webinars that we're covering is shown up on the screen in front of you. Again, they are all complimentary and all recorded. So our agenda, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Aaron will tell you his bio and share some information about the firm that he works for. He'll then get into his presentation, make some concluding remarks, and we will take your questions. In the event that we run out of time, we do have a full hour, but should we run out of time, Aaron's contact information will be made available at the end of the presentation. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. I've been in government contracting almost 20 years. Started my career with Dun & Bradstreet. We were selling financial information on businesses to the federal government, and this included selling that data to General Services Administration, GSA, some of the intel agencies, and then just the general contracting officers in pretty much every agency, and they would use the financial data to ensure that the companies they were about to award contracts to were able to maintain the terms and conditions of the contract and that they did have the financial strength. I've been a frequent speaker at some of the government contracting associations, primarily in the DC metropolitan area. And I started my business about 10 years ago, primarily supporting government contractors with anything from business plans, contract vehicles, some of the certifications, marketing, sales, and business development efforts. And then we also host events for government contractors periodically at the Kennedy Center in downtown DC. Our event draws anywhere from 200 to 250 government contractors. We typically bring in about 3 to 4 federal government agencies, and on top of that, we do have corporate sponsors. So enough about me. The real reason that we are here today is to let Aaron tell you about himself and share his knowledge about the politics of procurement. So Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a great turnout for the attendees, and without further ado, I will hand the microphone over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll keep the information about myself as brief as possible, but since there is a slide here with a very handsome picture, I joined the law offices of Cohen & Grigsby about 1.5 years ago after having my own government affairs practice and working with another government affairs practice that's based out of Pittsburgh, and then joining with one in Philadelphia. I am an attorney, and before I was in government affairs, which I've been doing for just about 20 years, I was practicing law, and it's amazing how much the two practices and disciplines overlap one another, especially when you're talking about developing opportunities for a government contract. Before I began that type of work, I was majority counsel for the Senate Labor Committee, went to law school and undergraduate down in Georgia, so a little further north now. The law office that I'm with, Cohen & Grigsby, based in Pittsburgh, PA, so I spent quite a bit of time here, as well as in Washington, D.C., of course. It's a fairly large firm. We've got an office down in Naples, Florida as well, about 140 attorneys. We span about 30 practice areas, one of which obviously is public affairs with a pretty big focus in Washington, D.C. the public affairs practice also has state-based work, primarily in because of our HQ here in Pittsburgh. But we do quite a bit of federal and state-based procurement work as well.
Great, thanks for that background. And for the folks on the line that are primarily focused on federal government contracting, as Aaron mentioned, they do also focus on state government procurement, so keep that in mind should you need help in that area. So I'll let you now dig into the politics of procurement, and we'll start with the first slide of your presentation.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. So I apologize for any paper rustling you hear in the background. I've got my notes. So the nature of any presentation that I offer sets up the context for what we're talking about. There are many ways to secure government contracts, but I always want to point out to folks that in doing so, that all contracts, there are grants and there are contracts out of the federal government, right? All grants are contracts, but not all contracts are grants, and there's a difference between the two. And I think that when businesses intend to secure government funds or government resources, depending on what exactly they're looking to accomplish in their business, they should not shy away from things that are not typically contracts. There are grants available to help profits and nonprofits, and every single one of those grants is in fact a contract. You know, you may not have to necessarily have any ROI for the federal government, but you certainly have requirements that you need to fulfill in order to receive the quote free money. So within that, there are many different types of grants and there are many different types of contracts. I don't think that appropriations or earmarked funds are gone forever. They have been for some time, but I do believe that as a legislative tool and as a method of providing dollars to the private sector, they will make a comeback. You, of course, also have small business innovative research grants, small business tech transfer research grants, both of which are prominent in several agencies across the federal government. You may be familiar with those. Those are a pretty clear combination of grants, contracts, depending on which agency they come out of. But then there are a lot of other ways to secure money or investment or resources, all of which are non-dilutive from the federal government. One example are CRADAs, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements. These are instances where a company who may have a need for research and development or some sort of testing may partner with, in many cases, a federal laboratory, whether it's Department of Energy, Department of Defense, for access to free resources. If you are developing something that has an interest to the federal government or the federal government may feel furthers its ends, they may simply give you access to resources to help identify that answer. Those resources can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Programmatic expenditures are another way. Typically they're statutory if you're working under the auspice of a particular federal agency. And then of course direct sales. You know, the government buys everything. Pencils, boots, meals ready to eat, bulletproof jackets, lawn mowing services, roofing contracts. So keeping that in context is always helpful. So here's what you need to do, and this is really the meat and potatoes of the presentation that I offer overall. You need to ask and you need to answer the following questions, and you need to do so with a mindset of politics. And when I say politics, I mean obviously with a lowercase p. This is always a question of what you know and who you know. And in order to prepare yourself to engage federal contracting officers, this is where you need to start your evaluation to the extent you haven't done so already. Where's the money? What federal agency is right for you? There are hundreds of federal agencies that are out there. Some of those federal agencies may not seem like a typical match for items that you're selling or research and development dollars that you need. but in fact they may be. And it's worth digging into the missions of some of these agencies to identify where the money is that's appropriate for you to go after. So that's the where and the what. They're very much the same thing. Start to narrow down what you are looking for from the federal government by identifying where is the money that can be spent on what you're selling. Then ask yourself who in that agency has the money and authority to spend it. It's one thing to identify an agency, it's quite another thing to identify the person within that agency that you need to speak with. Do they have the money? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's always interesting to me when you know, we run up against frustrations, or clients will come to me or say, we've really had a tough time. This particular agency said, yeah, we really like what you're doing. We definitely need to have those services. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing. You know, let's talk further. And so they talk further, and then they talk further, only to realize that the person that they're talking with ultimately has absolutely no authority whatsoever to make the purchase. Well, don't bother talking to that person, obviously. You need to identify the person who has the authority. And sometimes you identify the person who has the authority and they say, yeah, we really want to buy this. We absolutely need it. Thank you so much for coming to us. And only to find out that down the road that person says, yeah, I could buy this, but I just don't have the appropriated dollars. It's not in my budget right now. Come back to us next year. That's a lot of wasted time. So in the due diligence of everything that is a federal contract prep, you need to find out who has the authority to spend the money within the agencies that you've found, and whether or not they actually have the money to spend. Programmatic priority is exactly the same thing. You need to identify somebody who has the priority of buying what you're selling. They may have the money, they may have the authority to buy it, but for whatever reason, this fiscal year, buying what you're selling is number 5 on their things that they need to purchase. So you need to identify the agency that has a mission for what you're selling. You need to identify the person within the agency that has money to buy it and the authority to spend it, and then you need to make sure that the priority that that person has is at the top of the list. They can only do so much even with the authority and the money that they have, and if what you're selling is number 5 on their list, they may just not get to you. And finally, the politics of thing really comes into play when you determine when you should go and ask them to spend the money. A lot of what federal government agencies need to rely on is the federal appropriations process. Do they have money left over from the previous fiscal year? Are they expecting money from the new fiscal year? Is it possible to transition money from one federal agency to another? How long will it take? When do those deadlines take place? Who has the authority to make those transfers and in what timeline? So that's something that really needs to be fleshed out so that you don't waste, again, so that you don't waste a lot of time talking with somebody only to find out, yeah, come to us again in 2 months, or come to us again this time next year. So it's really a narrowing process, and finally you'll be able to discern the who, the where, the what, and that's your sales target. So that's the next slide. You've figured it out, you've identified your sales target, and now the question becomes exactly how are you going to go about selling what you know they're buying. And that's where the relationships come into play, creativity comes into play, developing a strategic approach comes into play. You know, to put a twist on an old adage, it's not only what you know and who you know, but in this instance I would even say it's what you know about who you know. And that is the art of developing an approach to securing one of these contracts. And when you do that, there's a lot to consider. Each opportunity that you'll come upon has their own realities. It will dictate different tools that you may want to consider using to develop your strategy. And I'm sure a lot of you have come across these opportunities and maybe even used some of these tools. This is a non-comprehensive list of some of the big ones that you'll want to consider thinking about. The GSA, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the backlog at the General Services Agency. People always ask me about the value of getting on a GSA schedule to sell their product or their goods or their services, and what I tell them is, look, it really depends. Contracting services off the GSA schedule can be very lucrative if you have the time to market your GSA listing. You also want to consider subcontracting. Small businesses to large businesses or large businesses to small. If you are a woman-owned, a minority-owned, a veteran-owned business, there are large companies who do what you do who would just as soon be your subcontractor as the other way around for everybody to secure the government contract that's in play. And of course, understanding who the big players are in your space already is also a good move. Maybe a lot of the conversation you have about securing a federal contract is had with a prime contractor as opposed to the federal government itself. Congressional influence is always something people ask me about as well. I give it shift these days, not because having them in your corner is a bad thing. It's not. It certainly opens doors and gets folks' attention, but in the long run, your resources are much better spent focusing on the agencies themselves than relying on anybody on Capitol Hill. That's just the reality of things until marks come back. Keep in mind as well that small businesses have the opportunity to secure set-aside dollars. In other words, every single federal agency is required to set money aside focused only on purchasing from small businesses, whether they're minority-owned or not. The rule of two, which takes on different forms, different nuanced forms from agency to agency, says, according to the federal acquisition regulations, that if two companies that are small companies present themselves to a federal agency for the purpose of competing for a contract, that the federal agency must set that contract aside for competition only among small businesses. Now, when I say that comes in different nuanced forms across federal agencies, you know, if the Department of Defense puts out an RFP for nuclear missile guidance systems and two, you know, small businesses come up and they say, we could do that, chances are they're not actually going to set that type of contract aside. There are probably prime contractors like Lockheed Martin and the like that will that the federal agency will defer to. But by and large, if two smalls approach a federal agency as wanting to compete for the contract at hand, the federal agency is required to set it aside, and courts have consistently upheld the ruling that competition is still met when small businesses are competing. And that goes directly to the federal agency's small business goals and the SBA scorecard. There are, as I said, requirements that federal agencies have to contract with small businesses. I'm going to come back to the spoon-feeding comment and just quickly comment on the IDIQ contracts. That goes back to the concept of subcontracting. IDIQ contracts, and many of you are probably familiar with those, are broad, open-ended contracts usually held by one prime contractor who is given the authority to subcontract out dollars up to a ceiling over a certain period of time as long as the work gets done. These IDIQ contracts are very lucrative, but they're also a little bit squirrely. I have some experience in this, and I always find it interesting where these IDIQ contracts land. For example, in working with a roofing company who wanted to provide roofing services to the Air Force, found out that for whatever reason it was the Smithsonian Institution that held the IDIQ contract for roofing services, and the Air Force was simply slipped underneath the Smithsonian Institution Constitution's IDIQ contract. So to actually do roofing work for the Air Force for that time period, it wasn't the Air Force you were contracting with or communicating with. Strangely, it was the Smithsonian. So it's worth getting an understanding of that particular tool as well when you develop your strategy, your how, once you've done your due diligence and understood your target, going back to that initial slide. The spoon feeding the contract officer, I always want to spend a little bit of extra words in talking about. This is truly political. It goes to the heart of what I feel is political, and it goes to the heart of what I feel is really the essence of schmoozing, if you will, to use an overused term, the folks that are in charge of doling out these dollars and securing contracts with the private sector. It's not what you know, it's not who you know, it's what you know about who you know. And once you identify the contract officer in your federal agency that has the authority and the money and the priority to purchase what you're selling, it's quite okay to do a little due diligence on that individual, him or herself. Take a look online and see what kind of presentations they may have done for their agency that may be posted. What are their predilections? What are their personal priorities? Do you see that they're also an avid runner and their times from marathons are posted online? What does their LinkedIn page look like? Having that kind of information in your back pocket when you approach the contracting officer can be pretty helpful. It can help bridge gaps that can only be described as political and personal, and it's okay to exploit those things. I'm not suggesting that anybody stalk anybody online, don't hang out outside their house, but understand who you're talking to. And once you understand that and you know that they are the right person to deal with, begin spoon feeding back to them with the exact language that they're using in their RFP what you can do for them as a contractor. It's critical, it helps, and it works. I think that a lot of times folks overlook that political, personal element of securing a federal contract. And sometimes, you know, it is a consultant, a lobbyist, what have you, that's worked with these folks in the past that can help navigate some of those waters and give you a leg up in not only identifying who to talk to, but how to talk to them. So
Great presentation.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, no, I was going to say outstanding presentation. So we'll now move on to your conclusions, and then I'll start reading off some of the questions that have come in throughout. So back to you.
So to the points, there are 3 of them. Discern your target. Understand who it is that you need to talk to, and discerning your target customers in the federal government is a science. The information is out there. You can discern who has the money, when they're going to spend it, and if they have the authority to spend it. Once you have those lined up, you know who you're going to talk to, so you don't waste any time talking to folks that are not authorized to spend dollars or do not have the dollars to spend to begin with. Then you develop a strategy as to how to hit your target. That's when you reach into your bag of tools and determine this particular tool, an IDIQ approach, is going to be much more effective than a GSA approach, or understanding who you're talking to and the fact that they are an avid fan is going to be important in this particular conversation. Understand how the agency likes to receive its information. Are you talking with the Department of Defense? Do they want to see a quad chart? Are you talking with the Department of Education? Do they want to understand how you're going to meet educational priorities, even if you're offering to mow lawns? Understand your target, and that is an art. Not undoable, but it's definitely something that you need to fill in before you develop a successful approach. And remember, point number 3, politics will always play a role. Agency priorities, available funding, contractor personalities. They're sort of these unwritten rules of the road in securing a federal government contract that successful contractors have a real handle on, and others oftentimes overlook and simply respond to an RFP without thinking about these sorts of details.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. I enjoyed that, and as I mentioned, it looks like we do have some questions that are coming in. I'm going to move to the next slide that has Aaron's contact information, so feel free to reach out to him directly if there's any question that either you don't want to type in or should we run out of time. So the first question says, can I use congressional influence to secure a contract that will create jobs in my congressional district?
No. That's not to say that congressional influence in that instance won't be helpful, but a member of Congress or their staff will not weigh in to help make a federal contracting decision. What they will do, and what does have a slight impact, at least insofar as opening doors, and having conversations with the right people in the federal agency, is that they will reach out to the federal agency, even the federal contracting officer, on your behalf, and they will let them know that it's important to the member of Congress that federal agency X gives their constituent a fair shake. In a lot of instances, that sort of help will get you in the right place, oftentimes at the right time. But when it comes down to it, a member of Congress or their staff, they will not make a call on your behalf and say something like, please do this because it'll help people in my district. They're just gun shy about doing that these days. That didn't always used to be the case. But the best that you can hope for from congressional influence is simply to have them weigh in as much as they're going to be willing, and the biggest benefit I've seen is that they'll open the doors for you to have the conversations on your merits. But they're not going to help pull any triggers, unfortunately.
Great. And this question sounds like maybe you have partially answered it. Can a member of Congress make an introduction to a contracting officer for me? And if yes, are there any negative repercussions?
The answer is yes. They can certainly help make that introduction, and no, there are no negative repercussions. I've never had an instance where a contracting officer takes a meeting that was asked for by a member of Congress begrudgingly, and that, and after the fact they're crabby and distant because it was the member of Congress that helped get the meeting. The only caution that I offer is to take the member of Congress's or their congressional office, take their lead as to what they're comfortable doing when interacting with a federal agency, and that'll be about as far as you can go with a congressional call. But from a contracting officer's perspective, no downside at all. It helps move things along insofar as getting you in the door and having the conversation, and I've never had any experience where it's backfired, simply because everybody understands that a member of Congress is going to have a role to play up to a point, and after that, the contracting officer is in charge.
Super. Next question here says, can your company help us secure IDIQs, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts? And if so, because you're a lobbyist, do we need to file any reports?
The answer is yes and yes. We have worked with companies in the past to help them develop IDIQ proposals and secure IDIQ contracts. We err on the side of caution, and that is to say that we always register our clients and ourselves as lobbyists for a particular effort. Reason being is that these days the definition of lobbying is very broad, and it includes any communication with just about any federal employee. And the communications that you would need to undertake to secure an IDIQ contract are going to be with relatively high-level folks at a particular agency. which are always included in the definition of communications, who you're communicating with. So the answer is yes, we have done that work, but we always register for lobbying activities just to be on the safe side.
Great. Next question says, our solution is technical in nature, and you mentioned that we need to know who within the government purchases this. So should we be looking for two contacts, one technical and one that holds the financial purse?
From that question, it sounds like it. I'll give you an example of an experience that I've had, well, a couple of times, specifically in working with the military. The procurement officers in the military are not the same people as the technical officers. And oftentimes, the procurement officers will take their lead from the technical folks in determining what they need and when they need it. The same has been true in recent experience with the Department of Justice when the FBI was looking to procure DNA analysis equipment and software. So the answer to your question, I'm going to go ahead and say is yes. You probably do need to have two people on your call list. And in this instance, I would even start with the technical person so that they're on board with things. They can be a very persuasive element when you go to talk to the procurement person, and they may even be able to help you identify the right procurement person. That's not always the case. Sometimes the technical guys are in a different state than the folks that are doing the buying, but they can certainly help, and so I would say, yeah, you probably need to have two contacts in that particular case. Not difficult to do, but part of the due diligence of identifying who it is that you need to go after.
Super. The federal fiscal year is ending at the end of September. Is it too late for us to get into the game if we've never sold into the federal market in the past?
No, it's never too late. First of all, the fiscal year will begin October 1, but unfortunately for everybody, there's no way that appropriations will be granted by then. I don't remember the last time that's happened. Furthermore, if you've never been in the game, a lot of the work that you're going to do is going to be relationship building in general, and that it's never too late to do that. Furthermore, again, sometimes depending on the federal agency that you're going after, now is the best time to secure a contract because some of them, believe it or not, are sitting on dollars that have not been spent based on their previous appropriations. And if they don't spend it by the end of the fiscal year, they have to give it back. And that jeopardizes the amount of money that they're going to get in the next fiscal year because Congress will look at the budget and they'll say, why are you asking for us, why are you asking money from us again at this level? You didn't even spend what we gave you last year. So in some instances, there's a real push to get that money out the door, and companies who play their cards right can take advantage of some last-minute sales, if you will, from the federal government because they are not in the habit of giving money back to the Treasury.
Great. And then the last question is, well, last question that looks like it is, how can we leverage state and local contracts to be successful in the federal arena?
It's a demonstration of experience. I think a lot of contracting officers want to know that you have handled similar types of work in the past. They want to know that you've been able to measure up certain accountability standards that the federal government is going to impose. And if you've sold to state, local, other municipal governments, oftentimes there's a correlation, and the federal government likes to see that. They feel that there's a certain level of experience there, and that's always something that a seller to the Fed can and should leverage. To that point, it's a good reason why people who have sold to the federal government in the past typically continue to sell to the federal government in the future. They see that track record, the federal government sees that track record, and they like to go ahead and stick with it. So it's a good way to demonstrate ability.
Great. Looks like one more popped in. Are there any industries that your firm will not work with, or are there any industries that you have a sweet spot for?
We haven't come across one that we haven't worked with. So I don't want to say that there's an industry that we wouldn't work with. We've done work in everything from healthcare to energy to education, workforce development. I'd say that right now there's sort of an uptick in federal spending in workforce development and educational programming, manufacturing. The federal government's also investing heavily in energy-related projects. So any technology that has to do with energy, whether it is alternative energy, energy storage, or traditional fossil fuels, the federal government is buying there. But I mean, at the same time, we've worked with companies who have sold janitorial services and have done, other companies that are selling leaseback options to the federal government. So it really runs the gamut. I'd say the sweet spot for us is really the process, the science of it, and then working with the client to develop the art of it. We've done work with munitions as well as, what do they call, up-armoring, Humvees and the like. So, whether you're talking about bullets or bulletproof, both sides of that equation. But it's really the process that we help our clients with, and then helping them figure out what the best art approach, the best strategy approach is going to be once we've nailed the science down.
And do you work with any associations, or do you have experience in that field?
Associations don't typically buy from the federal government, but I do have association management work. Sometimes associations work with the federal government on an advocacy policy initiative, and there may be procurement buried within those conversations. So the answer is yes, we do some work with associations, but typically not in the procurement field.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It looks like you wrapped up all the questions. Again, we've got Aaron's contact information on the screen, so feel free to reach out to him directly by phone or email or visiting the firm's website. The next slide here is just showing again the list of webinars that we're covering, including next week going through best practices for contract administration, unsolicited proposals, and even one of the topics that Aaron touched on, the SBIRs, which will be our concluding webinar on June 17th. Again, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us, and any last thoughts that you have for the group?
Well, have a great weekend. Jennifer, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I'm grateful, and I hope I can help anybody that's been on the webinar down the road. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.